to talk today about entanglement, which sounds quite abstract, but what I'm going to argue is that acknowledging, responding to, and using the fact of our entanglement with each other, with the rest of our species, as well as with the rest of the natural world, is critical for getting to any form of zero carbon future that we would like. We have a couple of examples. And it's funny because I think people have mentioned the early informative influences. I grew up in rural northern Vermont, and my father was a logger, and he was always talking about how one day people will pay you to maintain the soil and the trees around you. Look at all of this. And he was right. And I think hearing people reiterate that is important, and it's something I think that I'm hoping to draw some lines between that very personal experience with nature and the broader environmental governance changes that we need. So 3 examples. First is air quality. And I think Ridhima brought this up in a very tangible, salient, immediate way with the paying attention to the air that we breathe. But do you know where that air pollution comes from? Some of the common perceptions are that it comes from energy, it comes from power production, it comes from coal plants, it comes from cars. This is all right. It comes from municipal waste burning, it comes from fires. This is all also right. But one of the bigger contributors to air pollution that people don't necessarily know about is, so it's called secondary particulate matter, or the combination of gases from different sources into particles that you then breathe in. So think of this. So you apply fertilizer on a field. It produces off gases the ammonia. Ammonia can mix with nitrogen oxides produced by power plants, cars, industry. Those 2 gases combine to form a particle. The particle can then move over long distances. You breathe it in, particulate matter, and we see the health damages that we have read so much about and are so concerning for ourselves and for our children. So fertilizer, ammonia, power plant emissions, combining particles into your lungs. That's just one example of the kind of processes that take place over long distances, over time, mediated by chemistry that doesn't go away if we don't recognize it, that doesn't go away if we don't acknowledge it. Think about what you're watching this on. Think about the device that you're looking at, whether it's a phone, whether it's a computer. Where did that come from? Where did the raw materials that formed the screen, that formed the components, that power the batteries, where did those come from? Likely multiple continents. Where were they put together? Who manufactured the components? Who assembled those components? Again, almost surely several countries, multiple people across long distances. Where were those transported? The supply chain and the origin of things is often something that we tend to overlook. But when we're thinking about moving to a zero carbon world or a lower resource world, we can't ignore that. The larger problem of supply chains and the embedded pollution, the amount of pollution that is produced in the production of things that are shipped around to the other side of the world, is significant. And it doesn't go away just if it's not recognized. For example, if you look at accounting for carbon emissions in cities, there's a lot of talk of sustainable cities. What's produced in a city versus what is the emissions that are created by what's consumed in a city, the consumption-based emissions can be 2 or 3 times the emissions that are counted within those city borders. With pollution, similarly, if you look at supply chain air pollution, something like 50 or 60% of China's air pollution, for example, is related to the production of goods that are consumed elsewhere, in other provinces, in other countries around the world. This is, again, a second example of entanglement. The fact that everything we use, everything we consume comes from somewhere is produced by someone, uses materials from elsewhere, and the extraction of those materials is a contributor to environmental change that we may not see, but that nonetheless is real, exists, and cumulatively one of the bigger drivers of environmental degradation. The third example, think of what's made us all be here and be virtual. The virus, the zoonotic, and its sort of zoonotic cousins, or viruses that make the leap from other species into humans. Where did that come from? That came from many different chances that all came together in an unfortunate constellation. From choices we made about agriculture, about animal farming, about the proximity of our species with other species. It came from the fact that we travel as a species, we travel widely, we travel globally, we move quickly. All of these different features, each with its own explanation, a global economy, pressures for lower cost meat production, forest degradation, and land use that puts people and animals in closer proximity. Each of those has their own reason, their own logic, their own drivers, but they come together in an increasing number of dangerous zoonotic species transmission of viruses. And as People Baba brought up, this was one. This is probably a dress rehearsal for many more. But again, it's a form of entanglement between sectors, across geographies, and between all of us. And I think with those three examples, I just want to highlight that this intertwining of the fate of each of us as an individual member of our species, but also the intertwining of what humans do, what humans believe, how humans organize themselves, with the fundamental chemical, physical, and biological realities of how air pollution is formed, how virus is moved, how energy is created and dispersed through the atmosphere. That entanglement is something that we are simply not prepared to manage. Over the past 1.5, 2 centuries, we've organized ourselves. And I say 1.5, 2 centuries because this is relatively short in the lifetime of our species. It just happens to be, what we think of as modern history. We've organized ourselves into little boxes. We've organized ourselves into cities, into nation states, into defined territories. We've organized our governments into ministries, into the ministry of this, the ministry of that, the ministry of water, the ministry of power. We've organized our professions into specialties. And we've basically sliced up a complex natural world, social world that we exist in into a set of small boxes. And we expect this to work. And my argument is that if we want to get to a zero carbon future, that's not going to work, that we need to change that. We need to acknowledge, respond to, and use the fact of our entanglement. So there are 3 things that we can do. One is to use the power that we have as consumers. Sounds trite, but one of the things that matters, one of the things that sustains organic agriculture, local production, cruelty-free production, reduction of animal testing in cosmetics, reduction of deforestation in the production of candy bars, concerns from companies like Amazon that we just heard of about their supply chain emissions. It's pressure from people like us. It's thoughtfulness from people like us in what we eat, what we buy, what we wear, and what we expect those who we buy from to do. Now, that's not going to solve everything, because obviously we can't see all the way deep into supply chains without some help, without some willingness of governments to monitor, without organizations that can credibly certify agriculture as organic so that we actually know what we're buying. There's a lot of information that is required in order to ensure that our choices are actually driving those choices in production. But it's not going to happen unless we start asking about where things came from. And that's not new. That's something that some of the First Nations in the Americas, the indigenous peoples, used to do as a matter of course, used to honor the origins of, for example, the roots of the trees that produced the bark that helped make the baskets to carry other goods in. That whole chain was acknowledged and honored and respected. And it's something we've dropped. It's a form of response to entanglement that we need to bring back up. The second is that we need to organize ourselves around processes, not around people, places, and things. If we go back to the air pollution example, looking at air pollution as something that can be controlled in a little square inside one set of city boundaries, when the air doesn't care, it moves across boundaries, the chemistry happens over long distances. We need to accommodate ourselves to the natural reality and start to coordinate across airsheds, across the whole Indo-Gangetic Plain, for example. We need to work across states. We need to work across sectors. Our organization of ourselves doesn't really matter if we have contagion, for example, of viruses across national boundaries. We need to be much more comfortable with organizing our social structures, our governments, our markets, for example, to respond to natural realities. And that's something that can easily happen. That's something that is starting to happen, but we need to become much more comfortable with that. The third, and this is important, is we need to start connecting the dots differently. If you look at the history of our statistical system, what we invest in knowing, what we invest in counting, what we invest in tracking, most of those statistical systems were designed to count people, places, and things in order to assess readiness for war. How many trees do we have to build ships to sail and conquer another nation? How many sheep do we have to feed soldiers? How many people do we have to recruit as soldiers? Counting people, places, and things in a world that's dominated by the ebb and flow of chemistry, physics, and biology is pointless. If we're walking into a 21st century that is dominated by environmental change, we need to become much better at understanding and tracking those processes as they play out over space and time. The good news is we have a lot more information than we've ever had. We have remote sensing, we have the rise of the digital economy, we have technology that allows us to combine our knowledge. Some of what we know about biodiversity, for example. In fact, much of what we know about biodiversity comes from citizen science. It comes from people contributing where they've seen a bird or a salamander or a skink into a larger aggregated database that collectively, each person sees one bird or lizard. Collectively, we know much more about those patterns. So we need to start being much more willing to connect those dots differently, to see our world differently, to see the entanglement, and to orient how we know where we invest in science into understanding that. With those three things, if we're able to acknowledge, respond to, and use the entanglement that is the reality of the world that we live in, we may just do a little better in the next few decades to be able to create a nicer world for Ridhima and my son, who's about your age, Ridhima, to live in. And I don't think that we can, in good conscience, continue as we are without recognizing the need to pass on something better to our children and their children. There's a saying by a famous science fiction author that reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. We've stopped believing in this reality of entanglement for a couple of centuries. We have to go back to reality. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm coming in from Northern Vermont, but I very much miss India, where I have lived for over a decade and have many friends, well-wishers, and family. So thanks very much.